In the sweltering summer of 1847, 13 members of the prominent Bogard family perished within hours of each other inside their Grand Garden District mansion in New Orleans. Official records, buried deep within the Louisiana State Archives, list the cause as sudden fever, but the hastily scribbled notes in the margins tell a far darker story. Dr. Armand Tabido, the attending physician, later wrote in his private journal that he had never witnessed such synchronized suffering. The symptoms, he said, bore no resemblance to any known illness. The victims' fingernails turned black, their tongues swelled purple, and their final screams echoed through the mansion's halls until dawn. What made this tragedy even more chilling was its precision. Every single death occurred exactly 90 minutes after the family's traditional Sunday supper, and the only person who survived that night was Violet, the head cook. For 170 years, the Bogard tragedy has remained one of New Orleans' most carefully guarded secrets, sealed behind a wall of shame, fear, and deliberate silence. But tonight, we're going to uncover the truth of what really happened in that kitchen and why an entire bloodline vanished in a single evening. Before we continue with the story of Violet and the Bogard massacre, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, because stories like this are exactly why we explore America's darkest forgotten histories. Hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts from across the country. The truth about that fatal Sunday supper began long before the first drop of poison touched those aristocratic lips, born from a cycle of cruelty that would one day demand its due. New Orleans in 1847 was a city of stark contrasts. Magnificent mansions rose like monuments to wealth, while the foundations of that prosperity rested upon human bondage. In the Garden District, where Spanish moss hung from wrought iron balconies like funeral shrouds, lived the city's elite sugar plantation owners, cotton merchants, and shipping magnates who had built their fortunes on the backs of enslaved labor. The Bogard Mansion stood as one of the district's crown jewels, a 3-story Greek Revival masterpiece, with towering Corinthian columns that seemed to scrape the Louisiana sky. Octave Bogard had inherited both the house and the family's vast sugar plantation from his father, along with a reputation for being what polite society called a strict disciplinarian, and what his slaves knew as something far more sinister. At 43, Octave ruled his household with the same iron fist he used to control his plantation. His wife, Celeste, a delicate woman from a proud Creole family, had long since learned to turn a blind eye to her husband's cruelties in exchange for her social standing. Their children, Etienne, 19, Margot, 17, Philippe, 15, and little Amelie, just 8, had been raised to see the enslaved people around them as property, no different from the fine china or silver candlesticks that decorated their table. The mansion housed not only the immediate family, but also Octave's younger brother, Auguste, and his wife, Lucille, along with their twin sons, Henri and Louis, both 14. Auguste managed the plantation city business, while Lucille fancied herself a patron of the arts, hosting lavish salons for New Orleans' cultural elite. Completing the household were Octave's elderly mother, Grandmere Bogard, who at 78 still wielded enormous influence over family affairs, and Celeste's spinster sister, Tante Felicite, whose sharp tongue and sharper eyes missed nothing that occurred within those walls. Within this world of privilege and power lived 26 enslaved souls, each bearing the invisible scars of bondage. But none carried heavier burdens than Violet. Violet had been born in the mansion slave quarters in 1823, the daughter of Essie, the former head cook, who died of exhaustion when Violet was only 14. From that age on, Violet had been forced to feed the very family that owned her body and soul. She possessed an almost supernatural gift in the kitchen. Her hands seemed to know exactly how much spice to add, how long to darken a roux, and which herbs could turn simple ingredients into dishes that earned the Bogards' praise throughout New Orleans society. But Violet's talents came at a cost few in the house understood. She worked 18 hours a day, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast and collapsing long after midnight, once every dish was washed and put away. Her tiny, windowless room in the servants' quarters contained nothing but a straw mattress, a single change of clothes, and a small wooden cross that had once belonged to her mother. What made Violet's existence even crueler was her unique position in the household hierarchy. As head cook, she was responsible for maintaining the family's reputation for hosting the finest dinners in the district. Yet, she was forbidden to taste the very food she prepared. She judged every sauce by sight, every roast by smell, and every dessert by instinct alone. This irony wasn't lost on Octave, who took perverse pleasure in reminding her that while she created meals fit for kings, she herself would live on scraps for the rest of her life. The other enslaved workers regarded Violet with both respect and pity. They admired her skill and the small privileges that came with her position. She was rarely whipped, never sent to the cane fields, and sometimes received cast-off dresses from the ladies of the house. But they also pitted her isolation, for her endless work left little time for friendship or for the tiny moments of joy that made life bearable. Among the household staff was Samuel, the stable master's son. At 28, he had caught Violet's eye, despite the danger such affection could bring. Their stolen glances across the courtyard and whispered conversations after midnight blossomed into something deeper. Both knew that love was a luxury slaves could rarely afford. Still, Samuel dreamed of one day buying their freedom and starting a new life together in the free territories, a dream that, on the Bogard Plantation, was as fragile as a candle flame in the wind. Samuel's dreams of freedom and prosperity felt as distant as the stars themselves. Among the others in the household was old Moses, the butler who had served the Bogard family for more than 40 years. His bent back and graying hair told the story of decades spent bowing to their every demand. Moses possessed an almost supernatural sense of timing, appearing with a glass of wine before it was requested, vanishing quietly whenever conversations turned private. His loyalty to the family was legendary throughout New Orleans society. Yet, for those who looked closely, there was a cold, hidden fire burning behind his ancient eyes. Then there was young Lily, barely 16, who worked as a lady's maid for Celeste and her daughters. Her beauty had not gone unnoticed by the men of the house, and she lived in constant fear of the attention such notice might bring. She moved to the mansion like a ghost, silent, cautious, performing her duties with perfection expected of her, while desperately trying to remain unseen. In the stables worked Thomas, Samuel's father, a man whose knowledge of horses was matched only by his understanding of survival in a world built to break him. Thomas had outlived 3 masters and buried 2 wives. He had learned long ago that the key to survival was simple: never let your true thoughts show on your face. Life within the mansion followed a precise routine, refined over decades. Breakfast was served promptly at 7, with the family gathering in the morning room that overlooked the gardens. Luncheon came at 1 o'clock, often accompanied by guests from New Orleans' upper society. Planters, traders, and bankers discussing business or gossiping over fine wines. But it was a Sunday supper that stood as a crown jewel of the week, a ritual of wealth, pride, and family image. Every Sunday evening at 6 o'clock, the entire extended family gathered in the grand dining room beneath a glittering crystal chandelier imported from Paris at tremendous expense. The long table, which seated 20, was set with the finest china, sterling silver, and crystal goblets that caught candlelight like captured stars. These Sunday suppers were sacred to the Bogards, a time when business was set aside, and family bonds were displayed for all to see. For Violet, however, Sunday supper was the pinnacle of her weekly labor, the test that defined her skill and her worth. She began preparations on Friday, selecting the finest ingredients from the French market, crafting menus that honored Creole traditions while showcasing her extraordinary talent. The meal typically consisted of 7 courses: a light soup, delicate fish dishes, poultry seasoned with exotic spices, multiple vegetable sides using the freshest garden produce, rich meat courses meant to demonstrate both the family's wealth and her own mastery, and finally, desserts that were as much art as sustenance. The Bogard Sunday ritual was as predictable as the sunrise. At 5:30, they gathered in the parlor for cocktails, the men savoring imported brandy, the ladies sipping delicate cordials. Conversation flowed over plantation affairs, social gossip, and the latest political whispers, while the children sat quietly, absorbing the world of power they were born into. At precisely 6, old Moses would appear in the doorway and announce, "Supper is served." The family would then move to the dining room with the solemn precision of a religious procession. Octave always sat at the head of the table, with Celeste at the opposite end. The children and extended family took their designated seats according to an unchanging hierarchy that had been established years before. Grandmere Bogard, despite her advanced age, held her place of honor at Octave's right hand, while August, his brother, sat to his left. The flow of conversation during these meals was carefully orchestrated, each family member playing their role to maintain the illusion of harmony and prosperity. But beneath that polished surface, tension simmered. Quiet, dangerous, and inevitable. The spring of 1847 had brought a series of misfortunes to the Bogard household. The previous year's sugar crop had been ruined by floods, and creditors were beginning to demand repayment of mounting debts. Octave had been forced to sell off parcels of land and was even considering the unthinkable, selling members of his enslaved workforce to raise capital. The financial strain twisted his temper into something volatile and unpredictable. Those enslaved under his rule learned to read the warning signs. The tightening of his jaw as he studied ledgers, the sharp tone when giving orders, and most chilling of all, the icy stillness in his eyes when plotting a new act of cruelty. It was during this period of growing pressure that Violet's secret relationship with Samuel deepened, until it became something neither of them could hide nor deny. The event that would set tragedy in motion occurred on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in late June, when the Louisiana heat pressed down on New Orleans like a suffocating blanket. Violet was in the kitchen, preparing canapes for a dinner party the Bogards were hosting for visiting Charleston plantation owners, when she heard Samuel's voice outside, raised, trembling, desperate. She rushed to the kitchen window and froze at the sight before her. Samuel was on his knees in the dusty courtyard, his shirt torn and soaked in blood. Standing over him was Octave, whip in hand, his face contorted with rage, spittle flying as he shouted accusations. "You dare look at my daughter with those eyes," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the humid air. "You forget your place, boy." Violet's blood turned to ice as the truth struck her. Margot, Octave's 17-year-old daughter, had been spending more time in the stables lately. Violet had noticed a flush that colored the girl's cheeks whenever Samuel was nearby, and Samuel's own visible discomfort at the attention. He had done everything possible to avoid being alone with any of the white women in the household. But in the twisted logic of plantation life, a slave's unease at unwanted attention was seen not as fear, but as presumption. And presumption was a crime punishable by death. "Please, Master Bogard," Samuel gasped between blows. I would never." "Silence!" Octave roared, striking him again. The whip cracked, and another bloody stripe tore across Samuel's back. "Your silence is guilt enough." But what happened next sealed everyone's fate. As Octave raised his arm for another strike, Violet could no longer contain herself. She burst to the kitchen doors, throwing herself between the whip and Samuel's bleeding back. "Please, Master Octave," she cried. "Samuel's done nothing wrong. He's a good man, he works hard." The words died in her throat as Octave turned toward her. His expression shifted from rage to something colder, something infinitely more dangerous. The fury in his eyes became sharp, calculating. Around them, the other enslaved workers seemed to fade into the shadows, instinctively sensing that something terrible was about to unfold. "So," Octave said at last, his voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper, somehow more terrifying than his earlier shouts. "The cook thinks she can tell me how to discipline my property?" Violet's knees trembled, but she didn't move. She stood firm, shielding Samuel with her body. "No, Master," she stammered. You just what?" Octave hissed, stepping closer until she could smell the brandy on his breath and see the red web of broken blood vessels in his eyes. You just think you can interfere with your betters? You think because you can cook a decent meal, you have the right to question my judgment. The courtyard fell into an awful silence. Only Samuel's ragged breathing and the distant call of a mockingbird broke the stillness. Violet knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return, but as she looked down at Samuel's bloodied form, she realized she didn't care anymore. "Samuel is a good man," she said again, her voice trembling but stronger now. "He ain't done nothing to deserve this." Octave's laugh rang out sharp and cruel, like glass breaking. "A good man," he sneered. "He's property, girl. My property. And so are you." He leaned closer, his voice now a venomous whisper. "But I think you've forgotten that, haven't you? I think you've gotten ideas above your station." What followed was a punishment that went far beyond pain. Octave ordered Samuel locked in the stable's tack room with no food or water, declaring he would remain there until he learned proper respect. But for Violet, he reserved something far more cruel. From now on, he announced to the entire household, Violet will prepare every meal as usual, but she will not eat until every member of this family has declared themselves satisfied with her work. And since I am very difficult to satisfy, he paused, letting the threat hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The next 3 days became a nightmare beyond description. Violet continued preparing lavish meals for the Bogard family, while surviving only on water, and the rare scraps that old Moses or young Lily managed to sneak to her when no one was watching. Her hands trembled as she kneaded bread. Her vision blurred as she stirred sauces. Her legs wobbled under the weight of heavy platters. But worse than hunger was the psychological torture Octave inflicted. He would find fault with everything she made. The soup too salty, the meat too tough, the vegetables overcooked. Each criticism meant another day without food. He took visible pleasure in describing the taste and texture of her dishes, while she stood silently in the corner, forced to watch him savor every bite of the food she herself could not taste. On the second day of her punishment, Samuel managed to escape from the tack room, driven by desperation and concern for Violet. He made it as far as the kitchen before Octave's men caught him. The beating that followed was so savage that Dr. DeBito had to be summoned, just to ensure Samuel wouldn't die before Octave was finished with him. As the doctor tended to Samuel's wounds, he noticed Violet nearby, her face hollow from starvation, her eyes burning with a strange intensity that made him uneasy. "That girl," he told his wife later that evening, "has the look of someone who's been pushed past the breaking point. I've seen it before, in slaves driven too far. It's a dangerous look." Dr. Armand Tabito was a man who understood the fragile balance that held plantation society together. Born into modest circumstances, he had climbed his way up to become one of New Orleans' most respected physicians, serving the wealthy plantation elite and, when his conscience demanded it, secretly tending to the enslaved people whose masters would rather let them die than pay for care. He had seen enough cruelty to understand its effects on the human soul. Most victims, when pushed beyond their limits, would simply break, hollowing into lifeless shells that moved and spoke but no longer lived. But a rare few reacted differently. A dangerous few would turn their pain into something harder, sharper, focused. These were the ones who smiled while planning revenge, who waited patiently for the perfect moment to strike back. And as Tabito looked at Violet that day, tending to Samuel's wound with hands that should have trembled from exhaustion, yet moved with calm precision, he recognized the signs. He made a mental note to warn Octave that his cruelty was brewing something dangerous. But like many good intentions, it was one he kept meaning to act on until it was too late. On the third day of her punishment, something inside Violet died and something else was born. As she stood in the dining room, watching Octave savor a bite of her famous praline bread pudding, describing its rich flavor with theatrical delight, while she swayed from hunger, a cold, merciless clarity settled over her mind, like fog rolling in from the Mississippi. She began noticing things she had never truly seen before. The way Octave's hand trembled when he was anxious, proof that his financial troubles were worse than the family admitted. The way Celeste's eyes darted toward the brandy decanter whenever she thought no one was watching, revealing a secret dependence on drink to numb her life. The way young Philippe stole glances at Lily when his parents weren't looking. A look that made Violet's stomach twist with dread. But most importantly, Violet began observing the family's routines, their preferences, their patterns, their vulnerabilities. She noticed that Grandmere Bogard always took her medicine exactly 30 minutes before every meal. That August had a nervous habit of checking his pocket watch precisely every 15 minutes during dinner. That little Amelie always ate her vegetables first, saving her favorite parts of the meal for last. These small observations, once just part of her duty, began to mean something very different now, but as a way to control. Food, she realized, was the one thing every member of the Bogard family depended on her for, the one domain where she held complete, unquestioned power. Every bite that passed their lips came from her hands. Every flavor they praised was something she had chosen to give them, and if she could give life through her cooking, she could also take it away. That realization didn't come with rage or trembling hands. It came with the calm precision of a woman who had already died once inside and been reborn as something else entirely. The kitchen, once her prison, now became her laboratory. The sense of spice and sugar mingled with something darker, the faint, earthy bitterness of herbs she had learned about from Mama Bridget. In the quiet hours before dawn, while the house slept, Violet would grind powders and dry leaves with mortar and pestle, her movements slow and deliberate. She tested small doses first, on herself, on stray dogs that wandered too close to the kitchen door, on rats in pantry. She noted how long it took for the effect to appear, how the body reacted, how the signs could be mistaken for something natural. By the time August came, her plan was ready, as precise as a recipe she perfected over years. Each family member would receive a taste crafted just for them. For the patriarch, Octave, whose arrogance demanded that he always have the first bite, she prepared his favorite. Braised duck with a glaze so rich and dark it had the faintest trace of bitterness. For Celeste, whose nerves had grown fragile from brandy and sleepless nights, Violet designed a delicate soup, fragrant, soft, laced with something that would make her drift into a quiet sleep she would never wake from. The others, August, little Amelie, even old-grown Borger, each had their own portion, their own flavor, their own ending. Violet had made sure of it. When the evening came, the Bogard family sat together in the grand dining room. Candles flickered in crystal holders. The silver gleamed. Violet moved among them like a ghost, silent and graceful, her face expressionless as she poured wine and set down steaming platters. Octave was in high spirits, boasting to his guests about his disciplined staff, unaware that every bite he took brought him closer to the end he so richly deserved. Celeste murmured polite compliments, her voice slurred from drink. August laughed. Little Amelie giggled as she spooned pudding into her mouth, and Violet just watched, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. An hour later, the laughter stopped. Celeste's hand trembled, spilling her wine. Octave's face turned gray as he clutched his chest. The sound of chairs scraping the floor filled the room, followed by panicked shouts. Violet stood perfectly still, her eyes calm and empty. When it was over and silence finally fell over the Bogard dining hall, Violet walked to the window and looked out into the humid Louisiana night. The cicadas were singing. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and smoke from the kitchen fire. Behind her, the family she had served for years lay sprawled across the fine table, their faces frozen in shock. She didn't weep. She didn't pray. She simply whispered, almost gently, "Dinner is served." Bundle of herbs chosen with a precision that went far beyond culinary perfection. To anyone watching, Violet seemed every inch a devoted cook, focused, loyal, tireless. But behind her calm eyes, every choice she made, every ingredient she touched, carried a weight of purpose. The Sunday supper would not simply be a meal. It would be justice plated and served with elegance. In the final days before the gathering, the mansion pulsed with activity. Silver was polished until it gleamed like mirrors. Fresh linens arrived from New Orleans. The air was thick with the scent of wax and spices, mixed with a slow, simmering heat of anticipation. Even the Bogard children whispered with excitement, unaware that they were speaking about the night that would end their family's legacy forever. Violet worked from before sunrise until long after midnight. Her apron was always spotless, her posture straight, her tone calm. But inside, she counted every hour, every step, every breath. She adjusted recipes with the care of a surgeon. A few drops more of this, a pinch less of that. The powders and tinctures she had learned to make under Mama Bridget's watchful eye were measured out in tiny glass bottles, labeled only in her mind. Samuel, now strong enough to move about again, watched from the shadows of the kitchen door one evening. "Violet," he whispered, "you don't have to do this. There's still time to stop." She didn't turn toward him. Her hands continued kneading dough, firm and rhythmic, like the beating of a drum. "It's already done, Samuel," she said softly. "The moment I decided they couldn't take anything else from me, it was already done." He wanted to argue, but when she finally looked at him, he saw nothing left to reach. Her eyes were calm, unshaken, as if she'd already made peace with what was to come. On the morning of the supper, the sky was washed in gold, and the air carried the first cool breath of autumn. The house was alive with the clatter of preparations. Servants rushing, children laughing, guests arriving in gleaming carriages that kicked up dust along the drive. Violet stood in her kitchen, her domain, surrounded by the tools of her vengeance. Copper pots gleamed like polished coins. The great cast-iron oven glowed red with heat. Everything smelled of butter, rosemary, and slow-cooked sugar. It was a feast fit for kings and for ghosts. She began her work like a conductor leading an orchestra. Each dish had its rhythm, its place, its purpose. The roasted meats were infused with just enough of the right powder to bring fever and delirium within hours. The sauces, rich and creamy, masked the faint bitterness of herbs that would still the heart in sleep. Even the desserts, the delicate pralines and candied pecans that were Violet's pride, carried their own soft promise of silence. By late afternoon, the dining hall had been transformed into a vision of opulence. Candles glittered against crystal glassware, music floated in from the parlor, and laughter echoed through the house. When the first course was served, Octave raised his glass and declared the meal a celebration of divine providence and the rewards of discipline. His words rang with arrogance, and Violet, standing in the doorway, bowed her head to hide the faint curve of her lips. As she moved among the tables, refilling goblets and serving platters, she caught glimpses of each guest, laughing, eating, toasting. To them, it was an evening of triumph. To Violet, it was the closing of a circle. And as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared over the Louisiana sky, the feast reached its crescendo. That was when the coughing began. Sense of focus. He tried once to step closer, offering to assist with the plating of the fish, but the look she gave him froze him in place. There was something in her gaze, sharp, unwavering, and ancient, that told him this was no longer a matter of duty or pride. It was destiny. By mid-afternoon, the mansion was glowing with the golden light of early autumn. Carriages lined the drive, and laughter drifted to the open windows as guests arrived in silks and polished boots, their perfumes mingling with the scent of roasting meats and baking bread. To them, it was a day of refinement and indulgence. To Violet, it was a culmination of every wound, every humiliation, every whispered prayer for deliverance that had gone unanswered. As she worked, her movements were slow and deliberate, as though each stir, each fold of dough, each flick of the wrist was part of a ritual older than any of them could understand. The air in the kitchen grew heavy, not with the warmth of the ovens, but with something unseen, something waiting. In the corner, a small pouch from Mama Bridget's stall lay open beside a mortar and pestle. Its contents, dried roots, dark powders, and small, fragile petals, looked harmless enough, but when Violet ground them together, the smell that rose was strange and sweet, almost intoxicating. She added it to the custard meant for the bread pudding, stirring until the liquid turned the faintest shade darker. Outside, the guests toasted Octave Bogard's continued prosperity. Inside, Violet whispered a prayer, not to the god of the Bogards, but to the spirits her mother had spoken to when the night was thick and the wind carried the voices of the dead. "Let them taste what they've made of us," she murmured. "Let them know our silence's flavor." The dinner began just after sunset. Candles flickered along the length of the massive table, and laughter rolled like thunder. Course after course arrived, and each bite seemed to fill the guests with delight. Compliments flowed freely, and Octave himself called for Violet to be brought out and acknowledged for her genius in the kitchen. She refused, of course, as she always did, remaining in the shadows, her hands folded neatly before her. From the doorway, she watched as they devoured everything she had prepared. The turtle soup, the pompano, the squab, each dish a hymn of precision and revenge. Then came dessert. When the first spoon struck the bread pudding surface, its scent filled the room, a warm blend of vanilla, butter, and caramelized sugar. The guests sighed with pleasure. Octave raised his glass once more, smiling proudly. Moments later, the first glass slipped from a hand and shattered against the floor. A second guest blinked rapidly, sweat beading on his temple. A woman's laughter turned into a sharp gasp. The air thickened with confusion, then panic. One by one, they began to falter, clutching throats, grasping at the tablecloth, eyes wide with disbelief. Violet stood motionless, her face calm, her expression unreadable. The music in the parlor faltered, then stopped. The laughter that had filled the Bogard Mansion for decades dissolved into choking silence. And when the last candle guttered out, the only sound left was a slow crackle of fire from the hearth and Violet's soft whisper, "It's done." Stars. The scent of roasted meats, rich sauces, and freshly baked bread hung thick in the air, weaving to the murmured conversations and bursts of laughter. Every element was perfection, the kind of grandeur the Bogard demanded and the kind of spectacle Violet had promised to deliver. From her post in the shadows of the kitchen doorway, Violet watched as the guests took their seats. Her gaze moved deliberately across the table, cataloging faces, noting positions, calculating timing. Octave at the head, of course, commanding the room with his booming laugh. To his right, Celeste, pale but composed, her smile brittle beneath layers of powder. The mayor beside her, already sweating under the weight of his velvet coat. The judge and his wife across the table, chatting amiably, and scattered among them, every soul that had ever profited from her pain. The first course arrived, turtle soup, fragrant and steaming. Compliments flowed freely. The mayor declared it the finest he'd ever tasted. Violet's expression didn't change, but a small pulse of satisfaction flickered inside her chest. Everything was working. Next came the pompano, its delicate sauce glistening beneath candlelight. The table filled with the sounds of silverware, laughter, and praise. Violet moved quietly, replenishing wine, clearing plates, always attentive and yet invisible. No one noticed how her gloved hands lingered just a fraction longer near the serving dishes, or how her eyes flicked the clock above the fireplace after each course was served. The squab followed, rich and tender, stuffed with her secret mixture. Octave was on his third glass of brandy now, his cheeks flushed with self-satisfaction. "This," he declared loudly, "is why we are blessed to live in civilization, the labor of others bringing refinement to our tables." A ripple of polite laughter followed. Violet's knife paused mid-cut, and for a moment, her eyes darkened. Civilization, that was what they called it. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, an autumn storm brewing over the bayou. Inside, the conversation turned to politics, to sugar yields, to the future of Louisiana's wealth. No one noticed a faint tremor in Celeste's hand as she reached for her wine. Then came the meat courses, beef glazed with honey and cloves, pork slow-cooked until bones slipped free. The aromas were intoxicating. The mayor ate greedily, praising Violet's miraculous touch. Only Samuel, standing silently near the far door, couldn't eat. His stomach churned with dread. He saw how Violet moved, how her eyes never blinked as she watched them, like a hunter waiting for the final step in the trap to spring. Dessert arrived at last. The bread pudding. It looked harmless, golden brown, crowned with pralines and a drizzle of custard that shimmered under the candlelight. Every guest took a portion. Every guest smiled. Every guest raised their spoon. The first scream came from the far end of the table. Matilda Dufresne's hand jerked violently, sending her wine glass crashing to the floor. Then came a cough, wet and sharp. The mayor clutched his throat, gasping for air. Octave pushed back on the table, his face pale, confusion dawning as realization struck. What have you?" he rasped, but the words never finished. Panic erupted. Chairs toppled. Silver crashed to the floor. The chandelier flickered wildly as the storm outside broke in full force, rain lashing the windows. Through it all, Violet stood perfectly still. Old Moses stumbled toward her, eyes wide. "Miss Violet, what did you do?" Her voice was calm, soft as a falling rain. "Just giving them what they gave us, Moses." One by one, the voices fell silent. The only sounds that remained were the hiss of the candles dying in their wax and the roll of thunder beyond the glass. When it was done, Violet turned toward Samuel. He stood trembling in the doorway, tears streaming down his face. "It's over," she whispered. "They can't hurt us anymore." But Samuel only shook his head. "No, Violet, they'll never stop haunting you." Violet looked back at the grand dining table, the crystal, the silver, the frozen faces of those who had ruled over her life. For the first time in years, she smiled not in joy but in peace. Then she blew out the last candle.